my whole thing is called Blank Canvas, which might kind of come, my book's going to be called that. It might kind of unfurl as we go through this. And this idea around sort of postmodern pedagogy based around my research. So there's a quote from Otti Berger at a female student at the Bauhaus, who said, in order to become an artist, one must be an artist. And in order to become one comes to the Bauhaus. So to make that artist a human being once again is the task of the Bauhaus. So my research goes back to the start of the 20th century and looking at this idea that Bauhaus really brought into art education. So this idea about centering on the human being and looking at them rather than specific pictorial ideas. So yeah, it's really looking at, as well as sort of looking at this connection between art and music. Being an artist and a photographer, this has always kind of interests me, these two interjecting areas. And connections really to the start of the 20th century with Dada, there's futurism connections, surrealism, and then into punk. This is quite a common link. There's quite a bit of research done on this, but mine links it to education as well. And there's this idea that art is life, life is art. So the barriers between art and life are kind of reduced. And so art education becomes a cornerstone of everything. So if art is life, art education becomes part of that. And then really interjecting this is this concept of change. So when I'm going into the 60s and 70s, the idea that art's changing, music's changing, and also with that, areas of education. So a nice quote from Thistlewood. So an ideal learning environment is one in which an individual may discover his own aptitudes and test the relevance of his own ideas. In such an environment, art might accrue incidentally, a total development of sensibility and intellect. So this idea about thought and about the whole human again, these various, this kind of broader picture of education. One of my interviewees, Brian Eno, his ethos around art schools was that they managed to balance themselves on the fence between telling you what to do step by step and leaving you free to do what you want. So again, I'll be exploring this idea about the freedom that was in art education. For my PhD, I interviewed 8 people, but overall I've done about 20. And for the book I'm doing now, I've kind of expanded this out. There's a range of people across those art educators. So I interviewed Michael Penny, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago. Lovely Michael. He really got me on the route to a lot of this. Roy Ascott, who I think Penny will probably know, and some others. He's a famous art educator. Brian Eno, he's central to a lot of my music I've done over my life and philosophies, and I was really lucky to meet him. And he really connected me with Gavin Bryars, who's a experimental composer. Then all these other people came from there. So Dexter, who works at the Bath School of Art and Design, he was a punk bass player, and also he's a Saatchi artist. Stephen Malander from Cabaret Voltaire, he's an electronic artist, but also he works now. He didn't go to art school, but he works in the School of Art and Design in Brighton. Leicester Square, who's an artist, especially postmodern artist. He works with like a lot of government agencies, and he's a former guitarist. So all these people, they have interconnections between art, music. A lot of them are educators now. A lot of them are still professional artists. A lot of them are still professional musicians. So it's interesting to see that I think a lot of these people are still doing exactly the same thing as they were doing back in the 60s or 70s. This idea about art and music together. So Philip Glass, a minimalist composer, he liked the fact that his audience were artists, as he felt under less pressure with them because they were more accepting of his work. He stated how artists were open to experimentation, as the art world was always on the verge of something new, where the music world was on the verge of collapsing. So there was these different sort of, I found this a lot actually, these different things which are happening within the art and the music world. So my position, I found myself interviewing a lot of white men at the start, and this, yeah, it kind of troubled me. But it was, I suppose, it was a very white male orientated thing. But as I've gone through, I managed to interview a lot more women over the last month, 2 months, 3 months, and also sort of a few multiracial participants as well. But Barry Adamson, who was a bass player with a famous punk band called Magazine, I interviewed him a few weeks ago, and we talked about this position, and he was sort of saying, yeah, I mean, he's Black, English, and he comes from this position, but it's like, obviously we'd be looking at this from a very different perspective, and it's just making this very clear. I'm coming from like my perspective of what I've actually experienced. Dewey's philosophies kept coming through a lot of the research. So schools like Black Mountain College in the States, in the mid-50s, they were very much centered on John Dewey. So there's the art as life philosophy about experimentation, a worldwide perspective and appreciation of the everyday, which comes through with Dada and other things, and a student-centered approach. So where the power dynamic between tutors and students is reduced. And something I love and try and bring into everything that I do around education. And there's this great quote, which again links to my idea of blank canvas. That's the idea that people are lucky if they do not have to unlearn their secondary schooling. The idea that when you get to university, it's maybe a point where you start again, where you unlearn all that education that's happened through secondary school. So again, I'll show you how I look through the things like child art and the idea of outsider art, where before the education kind of takes away and becomes more directed on it. So postmodernism, it's I suppose it's a difficult word. I love the idea. And we're talking with Charlotte. We came up really with centering it on this postmodern idea. I really like the idea of postmodernism. Being a Generation X person myself, I feel very embedded in the idea of postmodernism, and I think it was really, I centered a lot of my ideas around my research around this. And so the main elements of this that I relate to postmodernism are the idea of truth and challenging grand narratives, reduction in the barriers between art and life, which I said recently, and an elimination in the high and low art divide. The concept of artistic depth as shown in relation to parody or pastiche. Eclecticism, so this multi-subject diversity. The idea of disruption or change in artistic forms. So these are the main sort of areas of postmodernism which I bring in and expand into the kind of conceptual theory that I developed. And almost like another cross theory around this was the idea from Belgian art philosopher Thierry de Duve, where he mapped the three main areas of art in education. So first, maybe in the 1800s, we had the idea about talent, skills, and imitation. So that's in the Romantic period in the 1800s. Then as the Bauhaus came in, the modernist period, where creativity, the idea about the medium, and invention were key elements. And then what I would call postmodern, he doesn't call it postmodern, but for me, it's very much postmodern. As the idea is about attitude, practice, and deconstruction. And these are the three main things which came up through all my interviews, a lot of the research, obviously around punk, post-punk and new wave music, and also the kind of punky attitude to a lot of the art school education, which I looked at. That's not to say all art education was like that, but the education I looked at had these key elements. And from that, so from looking at Dewey, like I've talked about, looking at de Duve, I also brought in a couple of other postmodern theorists, Ihab Hassan and Andreas Hudson, and created a four-part theory. This kind of evolved over time. And so it comes to these four main areas when I'm talking about the education side. So it's hierarchies and the idea of unlearning, the process, so the idea about process over products and the simplicity of the concept. Again, this is something which came very clearly through. Experimentation. So the third part is experimentation, the freedom to fail, having a space where you can just throw things in the air, see what happens. And then relationships, so interpersonal relationships, one-to-one, in groups, in scenes, and what Brian Eno calls a scenius, so a scene full of genius people. So let's have a look at these areas. So unlearning in previous education and creating a blank slate on which to provide the space and inspiration to explore creative avenues. Radical art school pedagogy concentrated on the artist rather than technique. So it's stripping away the actual person themselves rather than technique. And this, this idea that this is kind of a liberation, this is a liberation for people that haven't got certain skills. This is a liberation this opens up art rather than it being a kind of technical element where one kind of person can follow art. This is maybe like an opening up of it. And again, I think this came through me from the Bauhaus and Johann Itten specifically. He was a very interesting, spiritual, Buddhist-led tutor, Swiss tutor, who kind of brought in a lot of the main ideas that underlay a lot of the early Bauhaus idea. So it's the idea that education of young artists with a condition of physical, sensual, spiritual, and intellectual forces and abilities help to maximize innovative work. So he was thinking that, again, he was thinking about the whole person. How do you get the person into a state where they can maximize their work, their experimentation? And he said that the first goal of teaching should be to develop genuine seeing, genuine feeling, and genuine thinking. So empty, superficial imitation should be removed like warts. That idea that stripping everything away so you can come to the real stuff. The similar things came through. So in the UK, you've got Herbert Reed. So looking at childlike practices, as seen by William Johnson as well, another art educator. These are the same things. So if using phrases like blank state or tabula rasa, kind of going back to this purity. And later we come to Tom Hudson, who was a lecturer at Leeds in the 50s and 60s, and then he went on to Leicester and other schools. And he brought some of these same Bauhaus ideas into UK art education. So gradually, these Bauhaus ideas, they came in, started to be assimilated into some of the schools in the 60s and 70s, not all of them by any means. And there's difference of opinion on that. But Hudson was one of the main people that brought some of these Bauhaus ideas in. But it kind of opened up issues. So there's issues that, if you're taking away these manual skills, you're almost kind of going, okay, so why are we teaching art? Can it be taught? What are we teaching? It opened up all this philosophical debate around it. And so, a lot of these educators started to think about, okay, so if we're not teaching art, what are we teaching? So Joseph Albers, he followed Itten at the Bauhaus, and he was not quite as radical as Itten, but he had a lot of the similar ideas, and believing that you cannot teach art, but you can teach other things. So certain skills, ways to develop, to scrutinize objects and the world. So again, seeing the person and seeing their wider space. Through my interviews, a lot of these ideas have seeped into the schools that my interviewees have gone to. One of them was Alice Fox, who interviewed a few weeks ago. She went to Brighton Art School in the 80s, and she still teaches there now. And she says how she talks to her students about unlearning stereotypes, unlearning prejudices, unlearning unconscious bias, unlearning what you think a good movement is a good movement in performance, unlearning what you think is a good mark on a piece of paper in art, unlearning your value system around creativity, so stripping down your ideas. So I think it's very prescient at the moment, this idea about really rethinking and understanding where these ideas come from. So going back to the 60s, we had Roy Ascott, and this is where Brian Eno was taught. I mean, Roy Ascott was he learned with people like Richard Hamilton and Victor Passmore at Newcastle Art School, and he brought in these ideas around disorientation. So to get someone back to a blank state or to a blank person, he tried to bring in areas of disorientation. So some of these ideas that he brought in were things like, imagine yourself, you're a sponge, describe your your adventures during the day, or making a sculpture, then pulling bits out. He had all these ideas that were almost like trying to invert people. He did a lot of game playing, so students got into groups and they developed games, and they were like early personality games, really, and they had to find out what their personalities were amongst the group, and then they had to kind of become a different, or almost pretend to be a different person. So he got them to kind of understand who they were and then unlearn that and be someone else. This is radical stuff, and not everyone took to it. But I think some of the people that became famous and successful through it did take to it. So this is a point in the 60s where there was changes in art. So conceptual art was coming in, and Eno was taught on the ground. Brian Eno was taught on the ground course, and he got from Ascott this idea that really barriers between different subjects didn't necessarily have to exist. He went to art school expecting to paint, do Mondrian's, learn technique. But really, Ascott was so radical, didn't learn any technique. They just learned about concepts and the idea that gaps between things, that you can move between these different areas. Again, Gina Birch was one of my other interviewees. She had the same thing, but this is more into the 70s at Hornsey. She went to exactly the same thought when she was going to art school. She thought she'd get there to paint and be all emotional and all these big canvases, but instead she ended up doing a lot of conceptual ideas, becoming a film artist as well as a very well-known musician. And it was like the intellectual ideas, but it had to have emotional depth. So I think that's sometimes lost within postmodern ideas, that, okay, you've got to have all these kind of mixed up things, but it's still having these elements of emotional depth in there. So yeah, some more areas that that Eno kind of believed in. So yeah, part of the deal was what you were, what you believed in. So you became that person, you became the art piece. So it was really, really interesting, this idea that you're not fixed thing. You can change things about yourself, so you can see what it's like to be somebody else. As I say, they did these different games and explore. I think Eno was actually it's either Eno or Pete Townsend were put in they had to go around in a trolley for a term, and they weren't allowed to speak because they were so chatty. So that was just one of the examples of what happened. There are a few others which I will talk about in a sec. So the second part is process. So the first thing I'll be looking at is that idea hierarchy. So the second about process. So going back to Black Mountain College in the I know some of you know a bit about Black Mountain in the 40s and 50s, had the ethos, the realization that the way of handling facts amid the facts is more important than the facts themselves. So this idea about going into the process. So it's not what happens at the end, but it's like really focusing in on the process rather than the final thing that you produce. At that same sort of point at Black Mountain, there's people like John Cage doing her silent piece. So he did like music 4 minutes 33, which is nothing. Robert Rauschenberg had his white painting, so it's like they're just white canvases. That's really where my idea about black canvas came from. And this idea about simplicity. So Eno said that the idea of Ipswich is always on process. What you were doing, how does it work? How does this turn into that? Very little attention was paid to what came out of the process. That was really important. So this really led Eno's artwork. It led his production techniques. It led his development of ambient music. And it really defines, I mean, I can, without making this into a pop music lecture, it goes into bands like Roxy Music, and it really feeds through every person that I interviewed said that Roxy Music, if any of you know Roxy Music, were a kind of key band. And it was really, so you can see that this art school education came through into music through this way. And Eno talked to me about it. He had a big double pendulum in his studio, which is like instead of having just one sort of thing which you go like this, he had two elements on it, and he showed me this idea that a simplistic concept can create some kind of dynamic ideas. So by having two things together, so by having just that's quite a normal kind of thing, but by adding something on it, this would then go into all different directions. So this idea about something really simple, so by changing one rod to two, you can create this kind of multi-dimensional stuff. And that really, for Eno, that was the kind of central bit about his education, was that's what he learned, this idea about simplicity and complexity. And again, Gavin Bryars, who worked with Eno, was a teacher at Portsmouth Art School, even though he was a musician. He's still very focused on this idea about something being technically simple, conceptually very clean. I love all these ideas about simplicity kind of coming, so you can be complex if you're technically simple. I do that with writing and all kinds of things. I bring it into so many different things. And this led for him from like minimalist music and the sort of feel of the material. So there's a tension in the processes between conscious and unconscious creative processes. So this idea about intuition or thinking through, so this is something which came through. So the thought through processes and the automatic, the picture there is Itten at the Bauhaus, and he used to do breathing and movement exercises to get students into a state where maybe they could be more automatic with their creation. My way of doing it is by writing very early in the morning, having a strong coffee and being half asleep. And I'm doing this, so I think I do a lot of writing in that sort of stage. So where this idea about kind of getting your consciousness out of the creative process. So yeah, psychic automatism through physicality is something I love. That's quite an interesting thing to explore. And then experimentation is the third sort of part of it. So from the process, you come into experimentation. So because you're concentrating in there, you can then be experimental. So Eno said one of these things. Again, all the people I interviewed talked about the idea about the relishing experimentation. Art schools gave them the space to be experimental. That's what they were allowed to mess about, fail, do what they want. And there was an individuality of the art schools, a lot of the art schools which allowed this. And that philosophy about dismantling the old order, having an attitude. And it really came through the Coldstream reforms in our education, and the idea that individual art schools, even though they had to be within a structure, they were given a certain amount of freedom within that structure. So they had to meet certain criteria, but they were left on their own in a way of how they went to meet it. So a lot of the schools bent round it, and they actually brought in some more elements of kind of theory in, which kind of expanded the conceptual, the introduction of conceptual ideas into art. And there's also this connection between experimentation and commerce. And a lot of the students at art school got into music because they saw music as being an avenue for money. Like at the time, art exhibitions were just for the very few, whereas pop music was coming through, and that was really an avenue where they could experiment but also be commercial. So looking at some of the more experimental schools, say I talked about Ipswich and the ground course, Leeds College of Art and Design, they were very radical, very avant-garde as well. St Martin's Locked Room was where that went over, I think it was one term where 12 students were locked into a room every day for 9 hours, and just materials were brought in. They weren't allowed to talk to each other, and they weren't given any instruction. There's just different materials were brought in, and it was observed. There's the art theory course in Coventry, so art and language, the idea really kind of breaking down what art is and about it being very much about the critique and about having to explain what the art is. And then at Reading, Rita Donner's White Room, again on the same idea as the locked room, where students were, you're basically looking at the life room space, looking at the studio space and recontextualizing what it meant and how you could use that space. Briers again was in, he was in at Portsmouth, and he brought in these ideas from music, from experimental music into an art school and mixed them together. And he saw these experimental ideas as connecting from art, conceptual art, into music. So by the mid-60s, the art school became much more than just a site of reproduction of staple manufacture or an established conservative romanticism. So it flourished as a context for emergent countercultural sensibility and fresh experimentations in class. So Banks and Oakley saw a kind of class divide diminish at art school because you had grants, because you could basically go to art school, be on the dole, and if you went to art school, you got actually more money than being on the dole. So a lot of kids were encouraged to go to art school because of this, because financially it was a good thing to do. You didn't need great qualifications for a lot of art school. Depending on the art school itself, it's more, a lot of them took people just on their spirit, on their kind of, you know, their thoughts, their thinking processes. They were very a lot of open kind of assessment processes. And there was, loads of interesting kind of ways about how students were kind of brought in from different class groups. So this, again, going back to Black Mountain College, this idea of failure and experimentation. And again, this links in through to punk, where Malcolm McLaren had this idea about being a brilliant, flamboyant failure. And this is something which all the interviewees talked about, this fact that they were encouraged through art school or through the ethos of art school outside of it to just throw yourself into different projects and to not care how it went, really. And that sort of came through punk and post-punk. So as Gina Burt says, sometimes you throw yourself into something and as you're digging, you find a rich vein of something. And then Robert Filliou, a Fluxus artist, he outlined the main elements of art. So their motivations and values have a revolutionary potential, perhaps. So innocence, imagination, intuition, pride, passion, courage, endurance, independence, freedom, recklessness, and adventure. So these are great key elements about what it means to be an artist, or these main traits, what it means to be an artist. So yeah, there's a philosophy. So within the, especially within the post-punk scene, I found there was a lot of philosophy coming through art school. So tutors from art and language, there's the situationists, which are another group. There's a lot of politics, a lot of philosophy were coming through. So if you can't teach art, you can teach philosophy, you can teach these other things. So this is, a lot of these musicians came through. There was a lot of the lyrics, a lot of the feeling, a lot of the shows come through with the spirit of these philosophers. And again, some students, so I interviewed Pauline Black from Selector, two-tone band from the early 80s, and she talked about, even though she was doing science, that there was an element of art. So in Coventry, they had to do like an art subject, even though they were doing science. And I love that fact. And she said, yeah, okay, she used to hang around the art students, but she enjoyed the fact that she could do an art subject within science. So this comes to this idea of eclecticism, which a lot of guest tutors were brought in, science subjects, philosophy, politics, and it matches up with that postmodern idea about eclecticism and breaking down barriers and mixing disciplines. Great. And finally, I'm just going to go into the four main areas here. So I'll just go through this quite quickly. So relationships develop. So after the process of experimentation, you've got these four main areas. So the master apprentice, that relationship between tutor and student, the cohort, so this development of sort of non-class based groups and how these subcultures developed. in much smaller scenes in the 70s and 60s, and then senior. So when you had these groups of kind of patches of the more genius areas, and then collaboration. Again, going back to the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, the director, talking about the spontaneous enthusiasm that's generated when chance encounters brings people together. So this idea about chance encounters and serendipity again came through with how groups and how people came together. You know, how did Eno end up at school with Roy Ascot? He was just in Ipswich, it was the local school. If he hadn't gone there, what would have happened to pop music in general? There's all these kind of great synchronicity kind of elements that come through, and a lot of these artists bring this into their work. So developing the relationship together, learning from each other. So masters were and in lots of schools were encouraged to kind of be professionals and to generate their work with students and to have natural friendships and relationships with students. It was a very different era. I think I came into education at the tail end of this, at the end of the 80s, where we used to have tutorials in the pub, and I think there was a lot of this kind of breaking down of barriers. So at the Bauhaus, they used to have parties with tutors and students together. Again, in Black Mountain College, they actually built the place together, and used to, you know, have very. So this idea about breaking down barriers between tutors and students. But there's all kind of different issues. It was a meeting place, you know. Some of the interviewees found it was like there's lots of like-minded people there. Other people thought it was very sexist and very male-dominated, and they hated that fact. But they found that punk and post-punk was less sexist and more inviting and more kind of communal. So there's lots of different views about art education. Some people hated it, some people loved it, some people appreciated the educational aspect but didn't like the social aspect. But it did encourage non-traditional academics. And so this idea about seniors, so bringing where people interact freely in groups, and they come together, this catalyst together in certain kind of ecosystems, encouraged by certain people. So most seniors, they need to have like a central figure, and a lot of the female musicians especially were very drawn to a band, the Slits, and how they kind of encouraged women to be artists, to show that they could do what they want. There was no barriers to what they could achieve. They didn't have to be a technical musician. This is very much emancipatory for women in the pop music industry at that point. And yeah, I say this idea about guest lecturers were brought in. So industry, the idea about tutors being professional, bringing in guest lecturers, and a lot of the guest lecturers that came through an art school in the 60s and 70s were very high level artists, and they were paid well. So I think it was at Watford, Eno, Mark Boyle and Tom Phillips, they did guest lectures at Watford quite regularly, I think once a week, and they used to be paid £30 a day. So that's, 400, 500 quid in today's money. In an industry which wasn't generating so much money as it does nowadays, or it did, afterwards, that was good money. So they could get these high level people. And again, going back to Alice, who works in Brighton, she talked about collaboration. She does a lot of work with kids with disabilities, and she likes this idea. She talked about this idea of collaborating, getting to know people physically. So she said, how am I going to do that? Sitting and chatting in a cafe just isn't going to cut it. That's not going to happen. But moving together, creating a performance together where you have a laugh, you just copy each other and make movements and get to know someone through the building of a performance is the best way to spend time with these people if you want to get to know them. It's so inspiring as well, the ideas they're coming up with. So she just saw the physicality that she uses in her teaching relates to kind of some of these ideas that she learns at art school, and she learns being in bands, being in the punk scene. And finally, this idea, Robin Page from Leeds, that we're not interested in painters. What we want are beautiful people, which is a central thing, I think, which kind of summarizes a lot I've been saying. So in conclusion, the idea that it comes from Dada, Surrealism, Futurism to music, so punk, post-punk and new wave, but through this kind of postmodern education, this postmodern period, where the main things are art is life, life is art, that interconnection. They lived what they did. They lived their education. They lived their world. So there's non-hierarchical interactions. So this idea about unlearning, there's conscious and unconscious creative processes, experimentation and attitudes specifically were key, and interpersonal relationships kind of brought all these things together. So that's it. Thank you very much.